So I wanted to talk about this book, Strange New Land, that I hope everybody read. Um, this book is amazing in that he's so concise and he includes so much information that most people don't know. Let me back up. So when did Africans arrive in the New World? 500 years ago. They came actually with the Spaniards, and they were the first here. What's interesting is that we haven't heard this before. This is pretty new in the scheme of historians. That there was one named Esteban that we'll talk about in a minute. And then there was another one that I'm blank on his name, but anyway, Wood mentions two that were two Africans who were here in the New World with the Spaniards specifically, and then there were others, of course, but those were just the two by name. So why Africans? Why would they bother to enslave them as opposed to the Native Americans? The Native Americans, their population had been decimated by disease from the time that they were trading with the French in Canada, but even more so within no time of Christopher Columbus's landing in San Salvador in the Caribbean. Within just 20 years, the population had been of Tainos, who were the indigenous people there in San Salvador. Their population was decimated down to about 500 people within 20 years. So with the disease, that was not really a good option. There was constant warfare with these indigenous people. So who's going to be able to, you can't really enslave them. And the indigenous people could run away. They could live within, other tribes. They could escape, and they knew how to live off the land. So it wasn't like there was any obvious indication that they were a runaway enslaved person. Whereas with Africans, appearance alone was enough to clue somebody in that they were possibly a runaway enslaved person. Why not European laborers? Well, you have to realize these people, Europeans, were not looking as far as what we consider race. They were looking at whether or not people were Christians, or what they said, quote unquote, heathens, meaning they weren't Christian. So anybody who was not a Christian was a heathen. You put that on top of the fact that in the Bible, you were not supposed to enslave fellow Christians. So that's convenient. So you go and you find Muslims if you want to enslave somebody, and many, they say up to 20% of the enslaved Africans who came to the continental colonies, the English colonies in North America, up to 20% were Muslim. And the slavers, the people who went and kidnapped the slaves from Africa, they didn't bother to look close enough. They just considered them pagan or heathens, and they didn't really look to see, and they didn't realize that they were actually, many of them were Muslim. So you have that influence. They didn't mind enslaving Native Americans at the beginning because they were not Christian, so it was not against the Christian principles to do so. So that you had the Africans and the Native Americans. Well, the Native Americans didn't work out so well. The Africans were so off kilter by the time they arrived. They had been so traumatized by the time they arrived in the New World after being kidnapped from, the interior of Africa. And they were held in what were called factories on the coast, which were basically just like outdoor prisons. They were held there until the slavers meaning slave ships, would arrive, and they would take them away. Well, the conditions on the slave ships were so horrendous, and they were so traumatized by being kidnapped and mistreated from their homes and not knowing where they were going, and the conditions aboard ship were so horrible, that many of them threw themselves over the edge and were drowned and or eaten by sharks. If people got, if they got sick on board, they would throw them off alive, whether or not they wanted to, because they couldn't afford to have an epidemic on board a ship and kill off all of the human cargo. And they insured this human cargo for great sums of money because of the risk of, shipwrecks and those kinds of things. So this was a big money maker, particularly in the 1700s and in the 18th century. By 1750, indentured servitude was gone, and so the people who were left. So you had this bridge with the indentured servants from Europe. You had this bridge between the races. You had this class of indentured servants who they were the middle ground between free whites and the enslaved Africans. So when the indentured servitude was gone and conditions were better in England, and they didn't really people were not as excited about coming here, and also they could go to Pennsylvania and get free land, cheap land, and so they didn't really need to be indentured servants. The only people left were the Africans and those of African descent. So what did they do for the Spaniards if we back up? What did they do for the Spaniards to start with? They cleared land for plantations. They mined for gold and or silver, particularly in Mexico, present-day Mexico, and also in the Andes with the indigenous worker and the indigenous slaves there. The Spaniards were able to enslave the Incas early on to mine for silver in the Andes. And then these people also served, the Africans also served as soldiers, as sailors, and servants. And this is very early on in the exploration, meaning early 15th century, early 1500s. Pizarro was 1532. Cortez was 1519 to 1522. So this is early 16th century. You had these guys who were all involved in exploring. These are the big names of the guys who were involved in exploring in the New World. Esteban, this is really the only image you can come up with of Esteban, who, and he almost looks like a pirate with his sword and his hat and all. But Esteban is probably the best known of the Africans who were here. He has the name, he's the face of all of the Africans that were brought here by the Spaniards. In St. Augustine, by 1600, there were 40 Africans, and they were property of this royal garrison. This is San Marcos Fort San Marcos, and you can go there and visit now in St. Augustine. I went a couple of years ago. It's very interesting. There were 60 more who were the property of individual citizens. So basically 40 of them were owned by the government, so to speak, of Spain, and they were living in St. Augustine. And then 60 more were property of individuals, mostly Spanish-speaking males. They helped to build 100+ structures, shops, houses, and Fort San Marcos. They planted gardens, they fished, they sold their catch in the market, and some of them worshipped in the Catholic Church. This would be a drawing of Fort San Marcos in St. Augustine. Eventually, the missionaries in St. Augustine would offer up freedom to those who converted to Catholicism, meaning runaway enslaved people. Now, this is down the road in the colonial days. They offered freedom. If you could make it to Spanish Florida and you converted to Catholicism, you could have your freedom. Well, that was a big draw for a lot of people, and that is where the people involved in the Stono Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina, they were headed for St. Augustine. They just didn't realize how far it was, and that their chances of making it were, slim. But if they could get there, they could become free. The Spaniards actually had a settlement of free Africans living just north of St. Augustine at Fort Mose, and you can go there now, and there's not much there, but they're working on, and it's a privately funded visitor center, and you can go there now and see the marshy area where Fort Mose was, and these free Africans were running their own city. They governed themselves, they had shops, they did the whole bit, and it was a small thing, but it was still it's a good representation of how the Spaniards felt about those who converted to Catholicism. So you had issues in Europe that caused uncertainty among Africans in the New World. This Counter-Reformation, as far as the Catholic Church, the different languages that were spoken in Europe, and the status and how the different countries, whether or not they enslaved Africans or not, like the Spaniards, the ones that were willing to grant freedom if they converted to Catholicism. So, and then the location of where all these people were. So there were, what people forget is that, or they don't realize, is that in colonial times, everything that happened in Europe affected all of the colonies around the world. So if England was in a fight with Spain in Europe, all of the English colonies were in that fight as well against the Spanish colonies. So they got dragged into it, so to speak. So the people who arrived before 1680, they had various backgrounds. Many of them had extensive Caribbean experience. Those enslaved in the West Indies, some were free, some were not. Some were free if they were here in the North American colonies. In Virginia, actually the first enslaved people were not technically enslaved. The people who arrived at Jamestown, some of them were indentured servants. And in the middle 17th century, meaning 1630 to 1690, the Africans who could buy their freedom, they could earn their freedom. And there was on the eastern shore of Virginia, there was a group of Africans who were business people, and they were carrying on business. They did business with white people. They did business with other Africans. They had their own community, and they also enslaved other Africans. They enslaved Native Americans, and they had white indentured servants all working for these African owners. Now that is a pretty big deal in the mid-1600s, the fact that other Africans were enslaving other Africans, other Native Americans, and had indentured servants, and they were owning these people. So what happens is, by 1690, Virginia sees that they're going to need to crack down on their slave code. And so they take, over the 1670 to 1690-ish, the Africans see their freedom going away. If you were living between 1630 and 1690, you had a lot more freedom in 1630 than you had in 1690. They wrote the codes in Virginia so that the laws cracked down and strengthened or tightened those rules down for the Africans in order to keep them enslaved, so that there were no loopholes in which they could get their freedom. So you had a lot less freedom by 1690 than you did in 1630. Between 1600 and 1670, physical survival was more important, and they didn't care what you looked like, what your ethnic background was. All they cared about was survival. Once survival is not so precarious, then they could start worrying about cracking down on these codes and making it tougher. This is an image just of working in the cane fields in the Caribbean. once you landed in the Caribbean, if you were from Africa, you had your life expectancy was 2 years. The Caribbean and Brazil, life on a cane plantation was a bad thing, and overwork, malnutrition, poor treatment, all caused, and disease, major disease, caused all sorts of issues for the Africans. So once you arrived in the Caribbean, if that's where you stayed, and you were not put on another ship going to the North America, your life expectancy was 2 years. They had a huge turnover because these people died off so fast. And this is the thing that people don't also understand. Of the millions of slaves who were kidnapped from Africa, only 5% arrived in the North American colonies. This was our part in it was a drop in the bucket, so to speak, because the ones in Brazil and in the Caribbean the turnover was so bad because they died so fast. So, we think that we're the only ones who perpetrated this horror, and that is not the case at all. In the Caribbean and the Brazil, it was much, much worse. And that doesn't mean that we're not, that we're not responsible as Americans. That doesn't mean that, it absolves the United States of any responsibility. It just means that we were a small part of that. Also, by the time you get to 1690-ish, things are better here. People have more, they have better quality of life as far as the enslaved people have better food. They have better shelter. And they get disease less. They have less disease. So you start to have a more profitable group, a prosperous group, and that means that their natural increase, meaning enslaved people, they marry, they have families, so you have a natural increase through reproduction because they're having children, and so that is lucrative for the people who own them because the condition of the mother is the condition of the child, and that's one of the laws that they put into place about 1690. If your mother is an enslaved person, her child is an enslaved person. Now that means that even if the child's father is a white owner, doesn't matter, because that's a loophole that they closed. So that people said, well, my dad's a free white guy, so why can't I be free? And so they closed that loophole real quick so that the condition of the mother is the condition of the child. The English term for Africans was blackamoors, which this was news to me. I had never heard this term before I read this book. You had an increasing number of Africans in New England. New England never had the number of enslaved people that they did in the South. They didn't have plantations. They didn't need that kind of labor, the masses of free labor like they did in the South. Did they benefit? Yes. The textile mills. Where did that cotton come from later on? Where did the cotton come from that they were milling and processing to make fabric? Well, it came from slave labor working in cotton fields. So to sit there and say that the North was not guilty, they were indirectly benefiting from slave labor. And to say that they were not just as culpable is erroneous. These legal codes impose this hereditary enslavement, as I said, with the moms. The condition of the mother is the condition of the child. And they also began in New England because they had shipbuilders. Shipbuilding was a huge economic activity in New England. They started directly importing their Africans. They did not get them from the Caribbean, as had been the case before, because the traders thought, well, we can have a bigger profit here. So this is what I was saying about the mid-1650s, the condition of unfree colonists beginning, and this is particularly in the English colonies, that their freedoms began to dry up. They were decreased. in the Spanish New World, this hereditary servitude was set up before, based on race. And so there again, they were closing the loophole that if you converted to Catholicism or Christianity, eventually Christianity of any sort, just because you were a Christian didn't mean that you could be free. What they did was they said, okay, so you are of African descent, so that means that you are a slave. And so they made it based on race, not on religion. So all of this changed, and the nature of enslavement was very different year to year, decade to decade, colony to colony, family to family. It's very difficult. I'm making blanket statements, but every situation was different. Every situation was different. But you can make some generalizations, but there were a lot of situations were specific to any group or any time or any family even. In 1650, there were no colonial English settlements or any settlements colonial from Spain or anywhere else. South of the Chesapeake Bay area, meaning Virginia, there was nothing. There was no Carolina. There was no, because Carolina was, North and South Carolina were just Carolina at the very beginning, and they split in 1713 because their economic differences were so great from the low country of South Carolina to the up country of North Carolina, where they were more like Virginians. So they split in 1713. The colonial settlement south of the Chesapeake, the only one was St. Augustine. There was a steady need for labor because of this profitable thing called tobacco. It was high maintenance. It was a high maintenance crop. It had to be, you had to get these ugly, gross, humongous worms off of it. Every leaf had to be touched at least once a week. They had to get the worms off because the worms could eat a whole big, huge tobacco leaf in a day, one worm. So there were enslaved people all over the place. This tobacco saps all the nutrients out of the soil. So after a few years, the soil is no good and your tobacco becomes no good. And so you have to have more and more land. To make land, to rejuvenate the land, it takes years. And they worked really hard to replace all those nutrients that were sapped from the land. What they finally did, and this is what George Washington was big into, was experimentation. And what they would do is they would grow something else. Just because you'd grown tobacco there didn't mean that you couldn't grow rye or flax or wheat, because those plants need something different from the soil than the tobacco. So you could, it's basically an early form of crop rotation. So anyway, the priority of these people, and how did indentured servitude come about? Well, they wanted to add people of their own religion and their own nationality. Well, what better way to do that than to get indentured servants from your home country? There's no better way to do that. So you had these indentures where, and this is an image of an indenture, meaning a contract, where somebody signed it saying, I'll work for you for 5 years. Usually they were working for 4 to 7 years, and that included their passage, shelter, clothing, food. Now, they were basically slaves once they got here. So it was not like they were members of the family. They were slaves. And if you survived to the end of your indenture, which early on in the first half of the 1600s, it was questionable as to whether or not you were going to survive those 4 years to get to your freedom. At times, you would also be allowed to have 50 acres so that you could set up your own house, your own farm after your indenture was over. Eventually, you don't have that anymore. You don't have the land because the owners need the land for their tobacco fields. So what you had were freed indentured servants who were they'd worked out their contract, and these guys, many of them were guys, they were roaming the countryside, raising cane, partying and, causing trouble and being rowdy and, all sorts of less than positive behavior going on. So they had issues with crime basically after some of these indentures if they didn't have land to farm. How did this all transform as far as slavery? Well, you had this transformation, and it was this Mediterranean idea that enslavement was based on religion. But owners in the tropics, they said, oh, if race is tied to your condition, then it doesn't matter that you've become a Christian. It does not make a big difference at all. In Virginia, you had a lot of indentured servitude. You had a lot of enslaved people because of your huge need early on, your huge need for land. By the 1750s, indentured servitude was gone, and this was basically lifetime servitude, and they had to take all possibility of freedom by conversion away. So this is where you see the change from they were heathens who were not Christian. And the thing is Europeans only looked at religion. They were not looking at skin color. They didn't care. They cared about whether or not and this is Europeans in Europe and Europeans in the colonies. They only cared if you were a Christian. So if you were not a Christian, you were fair game to be enslaved. Between 1690 and 1807, English captains, now that's not counting the Spaniards or anybody else who might be commanding a slaver, meaning a slave ship, in just this many years, 110 years basically, they transported 2.75 million Africans. And only a small percent, as I said, 5% or less, landed in the Northern American colonies, or what became states. The changes were these strict legal codes. And so they were codifying slavery by giving it the authority of law, meaning they were putting this into law, which made it acceptable. If it's law, it must be acceptable as far as in the popular opinion. It's also, the popular opinion was, it's good for me. They like the white people like these laws because it provided them with a way to have a profit off of this very, very high maintenance, labor intensive crop. And this made it so that if you're going to control people who don't want to be there, you're going to have to dehumanize them. And so by codifying this practice, they also codified the fact that it was okay in the courts and in the court of public opinion to treat these people in dehumanizing manners. And so whatever you had to do to control that many people, what happens is you have many, many, many slaves and a few white people who were in control. Well, now as the percentage, and at some points by the time of the 19th century, in South Carolina, you had 60% of the population were enslaved people. And you had maybe an owner and his family, and they had 120 people who were there not by choice. They were not having any money. They didn't get any money. They didn't have any benefit from all the work that they did. And trying to control them was a task. To say these owners lived in fear every single day of their lives. 24 hours a day, they worried about their own safety because they knew that at any moment there could be an uprising among the enslaved population. So life for the white people was, if you were a slave owner, was not exactly all, moonlight and roses. It was a rough life because you were scared all the time. Now, the other issue is that people did not enforce the laws that were in place. So you have these slave uprisings like Stono Rebellion in 1739. These were the big ones. Nat Turner in 1832. Those were the two big ones that were pretty well organized as far as there were a lot of people involved. If you had a 500-acre plantation or a 1,000-acre plantation, your nearest white neighbor was a long way away. So you were basically out there on your own. And you had to worry about your family, and you had to worry about, what, enslaved person, you would have pushed him too far, and he would, he would attack, or they might get together as a group. And it's really amazing that there were not any more organized efforts than there were, because of the level of mistreatment and the inhumanity that was going on. So prejudice was present from day one. They never ever, and the Europeans, they always thought, they were Christians, so they looked down on anybody that wasn't Christian. You have to also remember, from the English perspective, anybody who was not, they despised Catholics from the days of Henry VIII. They were not, they hated Catholics. That's why James Oglethorpe said no Catholics in Georgia. That was a rule. If you were Catholic, you couldn't be in Georgia when, in 1733. So there was prejudice, but it was more from a religious perspective than anything at this point. And slavery is widespread by 1700, even though it's to a much lesser degree in New England, just because they don't need that much labor. All enslaved people were not farm workers. They were not field hands. You had house servants. You had artisans, and there were some of these enslaved people who were very, very talented. They had learned a skill somewhere along the way, and that skill was the key to your survival as far as a better life than a field hand. A field hand would have the hardest life because they worked in the sun all day long. They worked outside all day long, sun up to sundown, and it was back-breaking work. If you were picking cotton in the South, you were, and in the tobacco too, you were expected to pick a quota, a certain amount. And if you didn't, there was, hell to pay. So they were very, very overworked. But if you had a skill, you could be a barrel maker, a wheel maker, a blacksmith, a glass blower. All of these different skills made you an artisan. And if you had a skill, your owner could rent you out or send you to work in town. This is particularly in New England. They would send you to work in town. The person who hired you would give you the money. You would take the money back to the owner. The owner might let you have some of it. The owner might take it all. But you at least were off the plantation, and you were living somewhat of an unsupervised life. Even in Savannah, there were houses where you would have artisans, and they would live, enslaved artisans would live together as a group, like a group home, and they had a curfew, but they were on their own during the week because they couldn't travel back and forth to their plantation every day. So what they would do is they would live in town, and they would live together, and they would have to be in by 8 o'clock at night. Everybody had to be inside by 8 o'clock at night. However, they did have some semblance of freedom during the week. Also, the population in Virginia, these are just statistics here on the screen, but the population in Virginia of enslaved people, but in 40 years, way more than doubles. It was over 4 times what it was in 1680 by 1720. And then you look at the numbers here. You had 130,000 in 1760. Within 15 years, you had 185,000. You go from 40 years, the population is from 17% in South Carolina to 70% by 1720. This South Carolina is the most egregious colony in all of the in all of the colonies. In South Carolina, they found out that rice was a great thing. These Africans had been growing rice in Africa for generations. They knew exactly how to do it. And so and people didn't really understand. They thought it was malaria to begin with, but the rice paddies, are very boggy, and so they had horrible mosquitoes. And malaria is spread by mosquitoes. So the white people would not go into the rice bogs, into the rice paddies. So they sent the Africans, and the Africans knew how to grow this rice and harvest it. So they would send the Africans, and here's another instance where they would live independently. They would stay in the bogs for, days at a time, and they were supervising themselves. There was no white person looking after them. They were expected, they did what they were supposed to do. They worked, they lived on their own during the week or whenever they needed to, and they would stay for days by themselves. What they didn't realize, they thought that the Africans had an immunity to malaria because and the exposure to the mosquitoes wouldn't be so bad for them because they survived it. What they found out in the last few years, the reason that the Africans had an immunity, so to speak, against malaria is because they have the sickle cell trait. That sickle cell trait protected them against malaria, which is absolutely fascinating. And sickle cell is not a good thing at all. In this instance, for them, it's what protected them. But that's just an interesting biological factoid there. So again, you can't make generalizations about slavery. It varied from colony to colony. I tried to tell you a few things about like artisanship, field hands, house servants, those kinds of things. Owners could rent out enslaved people to neighbors who needed day work as a day laborer. But this is the thing. What you also have to remember is there was less than 10% of the slave owners in the South. Less than 10% were considered planters, meaning they had over 100 enslaved people. A young male might cost $1,000 in the 1800s. $1,000 then would be like $15,000 now. So you had to be loaded with money to own an enslaved person, even one. So you had very few people who owned any slaves at all. Vast number of whites in the South had no slaves at all. So what they would do is they would go to a planter who had 100, and they would rent out this person to work alongside that white person, to be a helper, to, maybe it was a job for two men, and so you needed to get some extra help. So they would rent that person out as a hired hand, so to speak. And so there were many, many different instances of the way things worked. It changed colony to colony. It changed, plantation to plantation. And I had always thought that we had done all this background in my family, and my mother had looked, and it was always, I was so glad because I found out that, I said, oh, so nobody in our family, nobody ever owned an enslaved person. And I was so proud of that because that was the greatest thing. Well, found out there was one. We did the DNA thing, and I have Ivory Coast blood. So there's a slave somewhere in my past biologically, which is just very interesting to me. And we don't know exactly where it was, but there's Ivory Coast. I have Ivory Coast DNA, so that's very interesting. But anyway, so how did slavery change between the American Revolution and the Civil War? This important date. These are the factories in the slave factories in Africa. These are just images of what they looked like. And these people were in really bad conditions to start with. If you survived long enough to get out of the factory because the hygiene was so bad, they got disease, You know, you've got people with, you don't have porta potties, you don't have indoor plumbing. So you've got people, you know, going to the bathroom all next to each other. And if they survived the disease, it was a miracle. Just to end up on a slave ship was pretty amazing that you survived this situation, you know, living in this. January 1st, 1808, with the Constitution, the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution, they just didn't know what to do with slavery because they knew that the southern states were not going to ratify a constitution that outlawed slavery. So they couldn't deal with it then. Their goal was to get a constitution together. So they basically set us up for the Civil War without really knowing it. They hoped that slavery would go away, but they said, okay. So by 1808, Congress can make a decision about what to do about the transatlantic slave trade. Well, so January 1, 1808, first thing that goes, there's no more transatlantic slave trade, which means there are no more Africans coming from Africa as slaves, which means that the supply is now limited. So the supply is limited. Well, if the supply is limited, your price goes up. So what they did was it institutionalized the slave trade domestically within the United States. So suddenly these enslaved people could become more valuable, and to the point where by the Civil War, the human property on these big plantations, the human property is worth more than the land, the house, the crops. The human property is where their money is tied up. And so you also have at the same time in New England, they're starting with abolition in the early 1800s. Well, these people can either manumit, which means give the enslaved people their freedom. Most people in New England, if you had any enslaved people at all, you had less than 5. And those were the really rich people because they just didn't need the labor source. So they would either manumit these people or they would sell them south. And that split families up, and that was traumatic to say the very least. Anybody that's ever watched 12 Years a Slave, that's a story where they kidnapped a slave, a free man. They kidnapped him and sold him south, and he became an enslaved person and had to stay there for 12 years till he was able to escape. So there's that. So they stopped the slave trade transatlantic anyway, but they don't stop obviously slavery is not gone, and so you start into all of the compromises that take place after this. It just makes it so that this is a pretty big deal. Is there still transatlantic slave trade going on between 1808 and the Civil War? Absolutely. The Wanderer landed is the name of a ship. They landed on the coast of Jekyll Island, and in December of 1858. And these two owners, had taken a dare to see if they could get away with bringing a load of enslaved Africans who did not. I mean, they were breaking the law. And they were lucky, quote unquote, that they were able to do it. But then finally, the last one was the Clotilde, and that was the ship that ran aground in Mobile Bay, and that was the last one. And that was December of 1859, which you were at the eve of the Civil War, and they're still bringing Africans from Africa. It's just unbelievable. But that was another dare that these two men took, and they decided to try it to see. The federal judges, if you ever went to court, you got caught, you went to court, the federal judges just slapped you on the wrist and said, don't do it anymore, and you got no punishment. So the federal government was not really into this. It stopped it to a certain degree, but there were still many cases where they were still bringing Africans. So there's that. I did want you to explain some about this book, and I hope that you enjoyed it. And if you got any questions, all you have to do is email. Thanks.